Tonight, we step into the forgotten dawns of ancient China, where emperors rose not from thrones but from starlight, and where the boundary between ruler and god blurred like mist over the Yangtze. This is the story of a figure so legendary that scholars still debate whether he walked among men or existed only in myth. They call him the White Emperor, Baidi in ancient Chinese, the celestial sovereign whose reign predates written history, whose capital has never been found, and whose tomb remains one of archaeology's most haunting mysteries. For over 4,000 years, dynasties have risen and fallen. Empires have carved their names into stone and earth. But the White Emperor, he vanished. Completely, his kingdom erased, his burial site lost. And the question that haunts every archaeologist who dares to look is simple and terrifying. Why does his tomb remain unfound after millennia of searching? The early Chinese landscape around 2600 BCE was nothing like the ordered empire we imagine. No Great Wall, no forbidden city, just vast river valleys shrouded in perpetual fog, mountain fortresses clinging to peaks that pierced the clouds, and forests so thick that sunlight struggled to reach the ground. This was the age before the Shang dynasty, before bronze gave way to iron, before emperors claimed the mandate of heaven. This was tribal China, a land of competing clans and shamans who spoke to spirits, where power came not from armies but from understanding the sky, the seasons, the floods. Imagine standing in that world. The air is heavy with moisture. Rivers swell with spring melt, threatening to drown the valleys. In the distance, smoke rises from scattered settlements, each one governed by chieftains who might live and die without ever meeting another ruler. And somewhere in this chaos, in a time so remote that it exists at the edge of memory itself, a figure emerged who would be remembered not as a conqueror, but as something far stranger. A shaman-king, a storm caller, a being draped in white who commanded the heavens themselves. But here's the problem. Every culture that came after him, every dynasty that claimed to unite China under heaven, rewrote the past. They erased inconvenient predecessors. They burned records that contradicted their origin stories. The Shang claimed to be the first dynasty. The Zhou claimed legitimacy from the Shang. The Qin burned every book that challenged their version of history. And so the White Emperor, if he existed, was buried not just in earth, but in silence. His story fragmented into myth, into folklore, whispered by peasants in remote villages, into cryptic references found in texts that somehow survived the flames. This is the world we're trying to recover. A kingdom wrapped in mist, hidden not just by time, but by the deliberate suppression of those who came after. Because to admit the White Emperor existed, with his own dynasty, his own capital, his own claim to divine rule, would be to admit that China's history didn't begin where the textbooks say it did. It would mean accepting that entire civilizations rose and fell in the darkness before recorded time. And that terrifies historians far more than it should. The legends say he was born from white light, that his mother was visited by a celestial phenomenon, a comet perhaps, or a beam from the western stars. Some stories claim he emerged fully formed from the clouds at dawn, descending to walk among mortals. Others describe a more human birth but with omens, white birds circling the moment of delivery, thunder without rain, rivers flowing backward for a single heartbeat. The color white itself is crucial here. In ancient Chinese cosmology, white wasn't just purity. It was the color of the West, of autumn, of endings and transitions. It represented metal in the five-element system, associated with war, justice, and the harvest. A white ruler wasn't gentle. He was decisive, unyielding, connected to forces that mortals couldn't control. His rise to power came during what historians call the late Neolithic period, that chaotic span between settled agricultural villages and the first recognizable dynasties. Tribes fought constantly over land, over water rights, over resources. Power shifted like the seasons. But the White Emperor, according to the fragments we have, didn't seize control through conquest alone. He claimed authority through knowledge. He could predict eclipses. He understood the flooding cycles. He knew when to plant and when to harvest. And in an age where one bad season meant starvation, that made him more valuable than any warrior. The ancient texts, the ones that survived, are maddeningly vague. The Book of Documents mentions a sovereign in white but doesn't name him directly. The Bamboo Annals, recovered from a tomb during the Jin dynasty, contains a single line about a ruler who commanded storms and was buried beneath the steps of heaven, whatever that means. The Classic of Mountains and Seas describes a being in white robes who lived in a palace at the edge of the world. But is this history or mythology? The line blurs. Chinese scholars for centuries treated these references as allegory, stories meant to teach moral lessons rather than record actual events. But then archaeology started turning up evidence that these myths weren't entirely invented. Cities older than the Shang, oracle bones predating written language, Ritual sites align to stars in ways that suggest astronomical knowledge, far beyond what early tribes should have possessed. And suddenly, the legends don't seem quite so impossible. Maybe the White Emperor wasn't a god. Maybe he was just a man, a brilliant man, who understood enough about the natural world to seem divine to those around him. Or maybe he was something else entirely. A shamanic figure, a link between worlds, someone who operated in the space between human and spirit. The texts don't clarify. They hint, they suggest, and then they stop, as if the writers themselves weren't sure what they were recording. The myths describe him as a storm caller, a ruler who could summon wind and rain with ritual and chant. In one story, an enemy army approached his capital during a drought. The White Emperor climbed to the highest tower, dressed in his ceremonial white robes, and lifted his arms to the sky. Within hours, clouds gathered. Within a day, rain fell so hard that the rivers overflowed and the enemy was forced to retreat or drown. Another tale speaks of a rebellion within his own ranks. A general who questioned his authority. The White Emperor challenged him to single combat, but not with swords, with heaven itself. The general stood on the palace steps while the White Emperor called lightning. 3 strikes. All 3 hit the general's sword, melting the blade and leaving the man alive but humbled. These stories sound fantastical, the kind of thing you dismiss as pure invention. But they also follow a pattern found in early Chinese cosmology. The belief that rulers were chosen by heaven, that their legitimacy came not from bloodlines, but from divine approval. Natural disasters, eclipses, floods, these weren't random, they were heaven's way of communicating. A good ruler maintained harmony, a bad ruler brought chaos, and a ruler who could control the weather, who could speak directly to the sky. That was power beyond military might. That was proof of heavenly mandate. But here's the problem. Later dynasties feared these stories, not because they believed them, necessarily, but because they represented a competing claim to legitimacy. If the White Emperor truly commanded storms, if he ruled with heaven's blessing, then how could the Shang or Zhou claim to be the first divinely sanctioned rulers? So the stories were altered, softened. The storm calling became metaphor. The white robes became symbolic. The emperor himself was demoted from historical figure to cultural archetype, a representation of the West, of autumn, of the agricultural cycle. By the time the Qin dynasty unified China, the White Emperor was barely mentioned in official histories. He'd been written out, erased, relegated to the same realm as dragons and phoenixes, mythical creatures that existed in art but not in fact. But the peasants remembered. In remote villages, especially in Sichuan and along the Yangtze, old women still told stories of the Storm King in white. Travelers reported strange shrines, unmarked altars in the mountains where local people left offerings of white jade and grain. And when archaeologists finally started asking questions, they found something unsettling. These weren't new traditions. They were ancient, unbroken lines of folk memory stretching back thousands of years. The White Emperor hadn't been forgotten by everyone, just by those who wrote the history books. If the White Emperor existed, he had a capital, a city, a seat of power from which he ruled his kingdom. But where? The most famous location associated with him is White Emperor City, Baidicheng, a temple complex perched on a cliff overlooking the Yangtze River near Fengji in Chongqing. It's a stunning sight, accessible only by steep stone stairs, with views that stretch for miles along the river gorge. Tourists visit by the thousands, drawn by the name and the legends. But here's the problem. The current structures date to the Ming Dynasty, around 1500 CE. There's no evidence that the site was occupied during the period when the White Emperor supposedly lived. Archaeologists have surveyed the area extensively. They've found Han Dynasty artifacts, some Tang period pottery, but nothing earlier than 200 BCE. Which means, either the White Emperor had nothing to do with this place, or any trace of his presence was completely obliterated by later construction. Some scholars argue the name is coincidental, that local officials named the temple after the legend to attract pilgrims and trade. Others believe the site was chosen deliberately because it held significance, even if the physical remains were long gone. There's also the possibility that the White Emperor's capital wasn't along the Yangtze at all. Some researchers point to the Wei River Valley in Shanxi, where early Chinese civilization first took root. Others suggest the Sichuan Basin, a natural fortress surrounded by mountains that could have supported an isolated kingdom. The issue is that without definitive archaeological evidence, without inscriptions or artifacts that clearly link to the White Emperor, we're left guessing, and every region claims him. Sichuan says he's theirs. Shanxi argues historical precedent. Chongqing promotes the temple. Meanwhile, the actual location of his capital, if it existed, remains completely unknown. There's a theory, one that doesn't get much attention in mainstream archaeology but persists in academic whispers, called the missing city hypothesis. It goes like this. During the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, China wasn't one unified culture. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, of independent settlements and proto-states. Most left no written records. Many built with wood and earth, materials that decay completely within centuries. What if the White Emperor's capital was one of these? A thriving city, possibly quite advanced for its time, that simply vanished when its political power collapsed. No stone monuments, no bronze inscriptions, just wooden palaces and earthen walls that eroded back into the landscape. If that's true, finding it would be nearly impossible. You can't radiocarbon date soil that's been disturbed. You can't identify building foundations when nothing but topsoil remains. The city could be anywhere, beneath a modern town, under a reservoir, scattered across farmland that's been plowed for 3,000 years. Some archaeologists have tried using satellite imagery and LiDAR to identify potential sites. They look for geometric patterns in the flow, landscape, unusual mounds or depressions that might indicate ancient construction. A few sites in Sichuan have shown promise. Ground-penetrating radar has detected what could be buried structures. But excavation is expensive, time-consuming, and politically sensitive. If you dig and find nothing, it's a waste of resources. If you dig and find something that challenges established history, well, that creates its own problems. So the missing city remains theoretical. A ghost capital for a ghost emperor, somewhere out there in the mountains or valleys, sleeping beneath the weight of millennia. The historical record is full of holes, gaps so large you could lose entire civilizations in them. And that's not accidental. When new dynasties rose in ancient China, they didn't just conquer their predecessors, they erased them. Libraries were burned. Scholars who refused to rewrite history were killed. Inscriptions were defaced. Tombs were looted and destroyed. The goal wasn't just political victory, but historical dominance. To control the past was to legitimize the present. The most famous example, the one that changed everything, is the Qin dynasty's book burning in 213 BCE. This wasn't just censorship. This was systematic erasure. Emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered the destruction of all texts except those dealing with medicine, agriculture, and divination. Histories, philosophies, anything that recorded the achievements of previous states was to be destroyed. Scholars who protested were executed or buried alive. Entire schools of thought vanished overnight. The Han dynasty, which followed, tried to recover what was lost. They collected surviving texts, interviewed elders who remembered the old stories, but the damage was done. Huge portions of early Chinese history existed only in fragments, in references to books that no longer existed, in quotations preserved by chance. The White Emperor's story, if it was ever fully recorded, likely didn't survive these purges. Any texts that described him in detail, that named his capital, or described his lineage, were probably burned during the Qin era, or lost during the wars that preceded it. What remains are scraps. A line here, a reference there. Enough to suggest he existed but not enough to prove it. Some researchers believe this erasure was deliberate. That later dynasties specifically targeted references to pre-Shang rulers because acknowledging them would undermine the claim that Chinese civilization began with the Xia, Shang, and Zhou. To admit that organized states existed before the Shang would mean admitting that the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, wasn't unique to the recognized dynasties. It would open the door to competing claims, to regional kingdoms asserting their own historical legitimacy. So the White Emperor and figures like him were systematically removed from the record. Not because they weren't real, but because they were inconvenient. This pattern isn't unique to China. Every culture rewrites its past to serve the present. But China's long dynastic tradition and centralized control over historical narrative made it particularly effective. By the time the Han scholars tried to reconstruct early history, the White Emperor had already been relegated to myth, and myths, convenient as they are, don't need tombs or capitals or physical evidence. They can exist purely in story, which is exactly where the authorities wanted him to stay. Every great ruler of that era was buried with ceremony and monument. The earliest Chinese tombs we found are massive. Earth mounds covering stone or wooden chambers, grave goods including jade, bronze, and sometimes sacrifice servants. These weren't hidden graves, they were statements, proof of power, of wealth, of a legacy meant to endure. If the White Emperor was a significant ruler, if he commanded storms and governed a kingdom, then his tomb should be enormous. It should be aligned with celestial markers, probably facing west toward the setting sun and the realm he supposedly governed. It should contain artifacts, inscriptions, possibly even human sacrifices. And yet, despite centuries of searching, despite advances in archaeology and technology, No one has found anything that could plausibly be his tomb. Not a single credible candidate. Which leaves us with a question that has no comfortable answer. Where is it? All great rulers of the era received monumental tombs. Why not him? The expected features would be unmistakable. A large earth mound, possibly covering a stone or brick chamber. Sky-aligned construction, with the entrance or central chamber oriented to specific constellations or solar events. Burial goods, including jade, bronze ritual vessels, and weapons. Possibly inscriptions or oracle bones recording his name or achievements. And protective measures because tomb robbing was rampant even in ancient times. Sealed chambers, false passages, traps designed to deter thieves. If such a tomb existed, even in a ruined state, archaeologists should have found traces by now. But they haven't. So either the tomb is in a location so remote or so deeply buried that it's escaped detection, or it was deliberately hidden in a way that's prevented discovery for 4,000 years, or it doesn't exist at all. And each of those possibilities is equally disturbing. The most straightforward explanation is natural disaster. China's landscape is violent. Rivers flood. Earthquakes reshape valleys. Landslides bury entire hillsides under millions of tons of rock. If the White Emperor was buried in a location that later experienced a catastrophic geological event, his tomb could be completely inaccessible. There are documented cases of ancient Chinese tombs being swallowed by floods or buried by landslides. Some were recovered centuries later when erosion or construction projects exposed them. Others remain lost. Consider the possibility of a massive flood. The Yangtze River, where the White Emperor supposedly ruled, has a history of devastating floods. In 1931, a flood killed hundreds of thousands of people and submerged entire cities. If a similar event occurred in ancient times, it could have buried a tomb under layers of sediment that now look like natural riverbank. Or consider an earthquake. The Sichuan region, often associated with the White Emperor, sits on active fault lines. A major quake could trigger landslides that bury valleys under hundreds of feet of debris. Ground-penetrating radar wouldn't detect a tomb through that much rock. Even if archaeologists suspected a location, excavation would be nearly impossible. Then there's war. Early Chinese history is marked by constant conflict. Tribes raided each other. Proto-states fought for territory. When a kingdom fell, its monuments were often destroyed, its tombs looted, and its records burned. If the White Emperor's kingdom was conquered, the victors might have systematically dismantled everything associated with him. Smashed his monuments, scattered his grave goods, even destroyed the tomb structure itself to erase his memory. This wasn't uncommon. Later dynasties did exactly this to rulers they considered illegitimate or threatening. The tomb would simply cease to exist as a recognizable site, just scattered stones and fill dirt indistinguishable from natural landscape. Another theory suggests the tomb was built using perishable materials. Most early Chinese structures were wooden. If the White Emperor's burial chamber was primarily wood, perhaps reinforced with earth but lacking stone or brick, it would have decayed completely within a few centuries. The mound itself might remain as a natural-looking hill, but without clear markers or structures, it would be impossible to identify as a tomb. This seems unlikely for a ruler of his supposed stature, but it's possible. Perhaps his culture emphasized simplicity in death, believing that elaborate tombs were unnecessary or even offensive to the heavens. More intriguing is the idea that the tomb was deliberately designed to be unfindable. Ancient Chinese tomb builders were sophisticated. They understood that wealthy burials attracted thieves, so they developed methods to hide or protect tombs. False chambers, unmarked graves. Tombs built in locations known only to a trusted few, who were then often killed to ensure the secret died with them. If the White Emperor's followers wanted to protect his resting place, they could have buried him in an unmarked location, perhaps in a natural cave or beneath a lake, somewhere that would never be accidentally discovered. No mound, no marker, no inscription. Just earth and stone and the slow passage of time erasing every trace. And then there's the strangest theory of all, the celestial ascension hypothesis. Some legends claim the White Emperor didn't die in the conventional sense. He ascended, walked into the sky, or was taken by heaven directly. If his followers believed this, they might not have buried him at all. No tomb because there was no body, just an empty altar or shrine where he was last seen. This sounds like pure mythology, but similar beliefs existed in other cultures. Emperors who became gods didn't need graves. They existed beyond death. For believers, this explains everything. For archaeologists, it's a frustrating dead end. Because how do you search for something that was never meant to exist? There's a place, a remote mountain ridge in western Sichuan, that locals refuse to name directly. They call it the Forbidden Mountain, though that's a rough translation. Travelers who ask about it receive vague directions and warnings. Don't climb it, don't dig there, the ground is sacred. Cursed, unstable. The stories change depending on who you ask, but the core message is consistent: that mountain is off limits. And the reason, whispered by old men in tea houses and hinted at in regional folklore, is that it contains the vanished tombs of ancient rulers, including, possibly, the White Emperor himself. Archaeological surveys of the region in the 1972 and 82 noted the mountain but never conducted extensive research. Access is difficult. The terrain is steep, heavily forested, and prone to rockslides. Local authorities discouraged excavation, citing both safety concerns and respect for indigenous beliefs. But there were reports. Hikers finding collapsed tunnels, fragments of white jade, unusually smooth and carved with symbols that didn't match known scripts. Stone blocks too large and too precisely, cut to be natural formations. And then there were the restrictions that came later, signs posted at the base of the mountain declaring it a protected zone, not for wildlife conservation or environmental reasons. Just protected. No explanation. No public documentation. When researchers inquired, they were told the site was being preserved for future study. But no study ever came. Decades passed. The mountain remained off limits. Some archaeologists believe there's a reason for this caution. If the mountain does contain ancient tombs, and if those tombs predate recognized Chinese dynasties, excavating them would create historical and political complications. It's easier to leave them undisturbed, protected by bureaucracy and local superstition, than to face the questions they might answer. Or perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps surveys were done quietly, without public announcement, and whatever was found was deemed too insignificant or too damaged to pursue further. The mountain is just a mountain. The legends are just legends. And the White Emperor remains exactly where he's been for millennia, buried not in rock, but in the realm of myth where evidence can't disturb him. The Bamboo Annals are one of the strangest documents in Chinese history. Discovered in 281 CE, when grave robbers broke into a tomb from the Warring States period, the annals were written on bamboo strips and had been sealed underground for over 500 years. Parts of the text had decomposed. Other sections were damaged by fire or moisture. But what survived was remarkable. An alternative history of early China that contradicted official records in significant ways. Among the fragments was a passage describing a ruler in white who governed during the age before the Xia dynasty. The text is frustratingly incomplete. It mentions his ability to control weather, his construction of a great capital near a river, and his eventual burial beneath the steps of heaven. That phrase, steps of heaven, has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some interpret it as a metaphor for a mountain. Heaven's steps would be the ascending peaks leading toward the sky. Others believe it refers to a specific architectural feature, a stone stairway or terraced structure built as part of his tomb. A few argue it's astronomical, that the steps are a constellation or a series of stars that were significant in ancient Chinese cosmology. The annals also mention that the burial site was sealed following a great catastrophe. The exact nature of the catastrophe isn't clear. The text uses a character that could mean flood, landslide, or even war. But the implication is that the tomb was buried, covered, hidden by events that occurred shortly after the White Emperor's death. Whether this was intentional or accidental, whether his followers chose a location that would be buried, or whether nature made the choice for them, is impossible to determine. One tantalizing detail appears in a later section. The text describes offerings made at the tomb by later generations, suggesting it was known and accessible for a period after his death. But then the references stop. By the time of the early Shang dynasty, no further mention is made. It's as if the tomb was lost, either forgotten or made unreachable, sometime during the transition between the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. If the Bamboo Annals are accurate, and that's a significant if, then the tomb existed, was known, and then vanished from collective memory. But the annals themselves are problematic. Some historians argue they're not contemporaneous records, but later reconstructions, compiled during the Warring States period based on oral traditions and fragmentary texts. Others believe certain sections were fabricated or altered to support political agendas of the time. Without the original intact document, which was reportedly lost or destroyed not long after its discovery, we can't verify the text's authenticity. What we have are copies, transcriptions made by scribes, who may have introduced errors or intentional changes. The reference to the White Emperor could be genuine ancient history, or it could be a later insertion designed to lend mystique to a legendary figure. The frustrating truth is that the Bamboo Annals raise more questions than they answer. They suggest the White Emperor was real, that he was buried with ceremony, and that his tomb was in a location described as beneath the steps of heaven. But they don't provide coordinates, they don't name the mountain or river, they don't offer details that could guide a modern search. They're a clue. A tantalizing, maddeningly vague clue. And like so much of early Chinese history, they hover in that uncertain space between fact and myth, frustratingly close to proof but never quite reaching it. Building a tomb in ancient China required labor, resources, and secrecy. The more elaborate the tomb, the more people were involved. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Chambers had to be excavated or constructed. Grave goods had to be crafted and gathered. And all of this had to be done in secret, or at least with discretion, because everyone knew that wealthy burials attracted thieves. The solution, brutal but effective, was to eliminate the builders once the work was complete. There are documented cases throughout Chinese history of tomb workers being killed, sealed inside the tombs they'd just finished, or executed to ensure they could never reveal the location or layout of the burial site. This wasn't universal, but it was common enough that ancient records reference it without shock or moral outrage. It was simply a practical measure. The White Emperor's tomb, if it was built with any degree of sophistication, would have required skilled laborers, engineers who understood how to construct stable underground chambers, astronomers who could align the tomb with celestial markers, craftsmen who carved the inscriptions and prepared the grave goods. And all of them would have been potential leaks, people who knew where the tomb was and how to access it. If the builders were killed after completion, the tomb's location would have died with them. No maps, no oral traditions, no way for future generations to relocate it even if they wanted to. This practice, as horrifying as it sounds, ensured that royal tombs remained undisturbed, at least until natural disasters or grave robbers eventually found them. But if the White Emperor's tomb was built during the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, the oral tradition problem is even worse. Writing was limited, or non-existent. Knowledge was passed through memory, through songs and stories, taught from one generation to the next. If the generation that built the tomb was silenced, and if no written record was made, then the location would vanish within a single human lifetime. Elders who knew would die, their children, if they knew anything, would have only vague stories, and their grandchildren would have nothing but myth. The tomb doesn't just disappear physically, it disappears from memory. And once that happens, it's nearly impossible to recover. We can search with technology. We can analyze texts and survey landscapes. But without even a general idea of where to look, we're guessing, hoping to stumble upon something that was designed, perhaps deliberately, to never be found again. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the tomb's location was erased so completely, was that an accident? Or was it the point? Maybe the White Emperor's followers didn't want future dynasties to find him. Maybe keeping his resting place secret wasn't about protecting grave goods, but about protecting his legacy. Ensuring he remained untouchable, unreachable, eternal. A ruler who couldn't be dishonored by conquest or forgotten by history, because he existed only in myth, beyond the reach of those who would erase him. Modern archaeology came to China relatively late. The field didn't really develop until the early 20th century, and by then, the country was in chaos. Civil wars, foreign invasions, political upheaval. Large-scale excavations were rare and often interrupted. By the mid-20th century, the communist government controlled archaeological work, prioritizing projects that supported official narratives of Chinese history. Sites connected to recognized dynasties received funding and attention. Vague legends about pre-dynastic rulers? Less so. There were attempts. In the 1972 and 82, archaeological teams surveyed areas associated with the White Emperor. They used what technology was available at the time: basic ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography, and good old-fashioned digging. They found Neolithic sites, early settlements, pottery shards, and stone tools, but nothing that could definitively be linked to a specific ruler or kingdom. The problem was funding and access. Remote mountain regions were difficult to reach. Local governments weren't always cooperative. And without compelling evidence that a site was significant, it was hard to justify the expense of thorough excavation. More recent efforts have used advanced technology. Satellite imagery can reveal geometric patterns invisible from the ground. LiDAR can penetrate forest canopy and map terrain with incredible precision. Ground-penetrating radar has become more sophisticated, capable of detecting structures deep underground. And some of these tools have produced intriguing results. In certain areas of Sichuan and Shanxi, aerial imaging shows unusual patterns. Circular depressions in the landscape. Linear features that could be ancient walls or roads. Mounds that don't quite look natural. Ground-penetrating radar has detected what might be buried chambers beneath some of these sites. But "might be" is the operative phrase. The signatures are ambiguous. They could be natural geological features. They could be much later constructions. Without excavation, there's no way to know for sure. And excavation is where politics enters the picture. The Chinese government is protective of its historical narrative. Major archaeological discoveries are announced with great fanfare when they support established history. But discoveries that complicate or contradict official timelines are handled more carefully. There's reluctance to excavate sites that might produce controversial results. If a tomb predates the Xia dynasty, if it contains evidence of an organized state before recognized Chinese civilization began, that's a problem. It challenges textbooks, museum exhibits, and national identity. So some sites remain unexplored not because they're uninteresting, but because they're too interesting. The Forbidden Mountain, the unnamed ridge where locals claim ancient tombs rest, is one example. Another is a valley in western Shanxi where ground-penetrating radar detected a large underground structure. Initial surveys suggested it might be a tomb complex, but permission for full excavation was denied. The official reason was environmental protection. The unofficial reason, according to researchers who spoke off the record, was that the site's age was uncertain, and authorities didn't want to open a tomb that might rewrite history. So it sits there, unexcavated, protected by bureaucracy, and the White Emperor's tomb, wherever it is, remains undisturbed. For now, there's an astronomical angle to this mystery that's often overlooked. Ancient Chinese cosmology was deeply intertwined with rulership. Emperors were considered sons of heaven, their legitimacy dependent on celestial approval. Tombs were aligned with stars, oriented to solstices and equinoxes. The placement wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate, part of a belief system that saw earth and sky as connected, with rulers serving as the link between the two. The White Emperor, according to legend, was particularly associated with the western sky. In the five-element system, white corresponds to metal, to the west, and to autumn. The constellation most commonly linked to him is the White Tiger, one of the four symbols representing the cardinal directions. The White Tiger constellation governs the western quadrant of the sky, a grouping of stars including parts of what we now call Andromeda and Aries. If the White Emperor's followers believed he ruled with the blessing of the western sky, then his tomb would almost certainly be aligned to reflect that. The entrance might face west, toward the setting sun. The burial chamber could be positioned so that on a specific date, perhaps the autumn equinox, sunlight would enter and illuminate the interior. Or, the entire structure could be oriented to match the position of the White Tiger constellation as it appeared on the night of his death or burial. These aren't wild speculations. We found numerous ancient Chinese tombs with precise astronomical alignments. The tomb of Marcus G of Zhang, dating to around 430 BCE, contains a bronze plate with star maps. The Mawangdui tombs included astronomical charts painted on silk. Even Neolithic sites like Taosi show evidence of astronomical observation and alignment. If the White Emperor's tomb exists, it's almost certainly aligned with something celestial. The question is what? And if we could identify the alignment, could we use it to narrow down the search? There are researchers who've tried this approach. They've used historical astronomical software to calculate where the White Tiger constellation would have been visible at various points in Chinese prehistory. They've mapped potential tomb locations based on geographic features that would allow Western alignment, and they've come up with a handful of promising sites. But again, without excavation, it's all theoretical. The alignment could point to a location, but that doesn't mean the tomb is actually there. Natural disasters could have destroyed it. It could have been looted centuries ago. Or the legends could be wrong, and the tomb, if it exists, has nothing to do with the White Tiger at all. Still, there's something compelling about the idea that somewhere in Western China, there's a tomb aligned to stars that haven't held the same position in the sky for 4,000 years. A tomb built by people who watched the heavens with such devotion that they encoded their ruler's final resting place in the movement of constellations. And if we could just decode the message, if we could understand what they were trying to tell us, we might finally find what's been hidden for so long. But the stars, like the Earth, have shifted, and what was obvious to them is obscure to us. The language of the sky, once so clear, has become another mystery layered on top of all the others. 4,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. Empires rise and fall, landscapes transform, rivers change course, mountains erode. What was once a valley becomes a lake, what was once a hillside becomes a cliff face. And anything built by human hands, unless it's extraordinarily well preserved or lucky, simply disappears. The White Emperor's tomb, if it was built around 2500 BCE, has been sitting somewhere in China for over 45 centuries. That's older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the earliest writing in Mesopotamia. And unlike those monuments, which were built to last forever with massive stone blocks and central locations, the White Emperor's tomb might have been more modest, or more remote, or both. Natural erosion alone could have buried it under meters of sediment. Flash floods, common in mountainous regions, can deposit huge amounts of material in a single event. Over millennia, that adds up. A tomb that was once at ground level could now be 30 feet underground, indistinguishable from the surrounding geology. Then there's tectonic activity. China sits on multiple fault lines. Earthquakes reshape the land, sometimes dramatically. A tomb built on a hillside could be buried by a landslide triggered by a quake that happened 3,000 years ago. The rock and earth covering it would be compacted and weathered, looking like natural strata. Even ground-penetrating radar struggles to distinguish ancient construction from geology in those conditions. And water complicates everything. China's history of dam construction has created hundreds of everything. Reservoirs, some of them enormous. The Three Gorges Dam alone submerged over 1,300 archaeological sites. Many were documented before flooding. Most were not. If the White Emperor's tomb was in a region that's now underwater, it's effectively gone. Not destroyed, perhaps, but unreachable. Diving at depth in murky reservoir water is dangerous and expensive. And even if divers located something promising, excavating underwater is exponentially more difficult than working on dry land. Then, there are the cultural factors. China has a long tradition of respecting ancestral graves. Even when exact locations are forgotten, entire regions are sometimes designated as sacred ground, off-limits to development or excavation. This isn't bureaucracy or superstition. It's cultural reverence, a belief that the dead should rest undisturbed, that ancestors deserve peace. If the White Emperor's tomb is in one of these protected areas, even if its exact location were known, there might be reluctance to excavate it. Not for political reasons, but for ethical ones. Is it worth disturbing what might be a genuine resting place just to satisfy archaeological curiosity? Some would say yes, that knowledge and understanding of the past justifies careful excavation. Others argue that some things should remain buried, that not every mystery needs to be solved. And maybe, just maybe, the tomb was meant to stay hidden. Maybe the White Emperor's followers chose a location specifically because it would be forgotten, swallowed by time and nature. Maybe the point was never to build a monument but to ensure rest. To place their ruler somewhere beyond the reach of conquerors and grave robbers. If that's true, then the fact that we can't find it isn't a failure of archaeology. It's proof that they succeeded. The White Emperor exists now, more as idea than fact. A figure at the boundary between history and mythology, real enough that ancient texts reference him, mythical enough that we can't prove he lived. His city is gone, erased by time or conquest or deliberate suppression. His dynasty, if it existed, left no clear descendants. His language is unreadable. His tomb, the one place where we might find undeniable proof, is lost. And yet his legend endures. Why? Some rulers are remembered through monuments, through pyramids and palaces, and inscriptions carved in stone. Their power is tangible, physical, something you can touch and measure. But others are remembered through whispers, through stories passed down in village squares and written in fragmentary texts. The White Emperor is the latter. His power isn't in stone. It's in the fact that for over 4,000 years, people have remembered him. Not accurately perhaps, not completely, but remembered nonetheless. There's something haunting about that. The idea that a person, a real human being who lived and ruled and died, can persist in collective memory long after every trace of their physical existence has vanished, that their all story, however distorted by time, continues to fascinate and inspire. The White Emperor didn't need a pyramid. He didn't need walls or statues or bronze inscriptions. His monument is the mystery itself, the unanswered question. The fact that we're still looking, still wondering, still trying to piece together who he was and where he rests. And in a strange way, that's more powerful than any physical tomb could be. A tomb can be looted. Inscriptions can be defaced. Monuments can crumble. But a mystery? A story that refuses to die despite every effort to erase it? That's eternal. The White Emperor has become myth. But myths don't die. They adapt. They grow. They mean different things to different generations. To ancient Chinese, he was a stormcaller, a shaman-king. To medieval scholars, he was a cultural archetype, a representation of the West and autumn. To modern archaeologists, he's a puzzle, a gap in the historical record that demands explanation. And to the farmers and villagers who still live in the regions where he supposedly ruled, he's something else entirely. A local saint, a protective spirit. A reminder that their land is ancient, that great things happened there long before anyone bothered to write them down. So maybe the tomb doesn't matter as much as we think it does. Maybe the search is the point. The process of looking, of refusing to let the past be completely erased, of insisting that even the oldest, most fragmented stories deserve attention. Because if we stop looking, if we accept that some things are just unknowable and move on, then we've lost something important. We've surrendered to the idea that history belongs only to those who could write it down, who could carve it in stone, who could ensure their version survived. And that's not true. History belongs to everyone who lived through it, including the ones who were erased. The White Emperor's silence, his absence from the archaeological record, is as much a part of Chinese history as any pyramid or palace. It speaks to the violence of dynastic politics, to the fragility of memory, to the ways that power shapes what we remember and what we forget. And that's worth contemplating. Tonight, the White Emperor rests somewhere unknown. Beneath a mountain, perhaps. Under a lake. Lost in a landslide or eroded into dust. His tomb, if it exists, waits in darkness. Silent. Patient. Untouched by the thousands of years that have passed above it. Untouched by the empires that rose and fell. The wars that ravaged the land. The modern cities that sprawl across what was once wilderness. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe some mysteries sleep for a reason. Maybe not everything needs to be found. But here's the thing. As long as there are people who wonder, who ask questions, who refuse to let legends die, the White Emperor isn't really lost. He's here, in the stories, in the search, in the stubborn human need to remember. Even when memory itself has been buried. Some rulers leave behind pyramids, others leave questions, and sometimes the questions last longer. Tonight, somewhere in Western China, a tomb sits in silence. Inside might be hate and bronze, inscriptions and artifacts. Or it might be empty, looted centuries ago, or never filled in the first place. We don't know. We may never know. But we keep his story alive. And in the end, maybe that's the only monument that truly matters. Sleep well, White Emperor. Your secrets are safe. For now.